there's many questions that can arise if your parents are thinking of living with you.
Mm,
It's absolutely essential that the parent and the child sit down and discuss these possible scenarios.
yeah.
And because most people only do this once in their life, it is best done if that parent and that child sits down with professionals who have experience guiding families through creating multi-generational housing, so you
Mm-hmm.
can discuss the pros and the cons and the risks
Mm-hmm.
to the parents and to the child.
Welcome to the Answers for Elders radio show.
And welcome back, everyone, to Answers for Elders Radio Network. And I'm here with Andrea Lee, who is an estate planning attorney from Legacy Estate Planning in Bellevue, Washington. And Andrea, you and I are talking about multi-generational housing. 40% increase since COVID of multi-generations living under one roof. And those are national statistics, and certainly something that we look at as we're talking about what's happening in our aging population. I know, Andrea, you and I talked about the considerations for a senior if they're going to be moving in with their parent. I'd like to switch things in this segment, and I would like to talk to the adult child. Obviously, an adult child's going to come and meet with you. Maybe they have their home in a trust or their assets in a trust. Maybe they have certain things, and all of a sudden they get in, a parent move in. There's a lot of considerations, I'm sure, that you look at in their estate planning over this issue.
Absolutely. So, I mean, there's obviously many ways this can be set up. In the situation you just brought to my attention is, hey, kids have a house and maybe mom and dad are moving into that house. And whether the house is in a trust or it's owned by the kids outright, there's many questions that can arise if your parents are thinking of living with you.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously the first question, which we touched a little bit on our previous segment, is maybe that house needs to be modified. In many circumstances, if we're blending a family and they're going to live together in one house, it does require a remodel of that house, or maybe the installation of an apartment, or a granny pod or something where mom and dad
Or
can
an add-on, or there's a million things that could happen. Yeah.
There's a million things that can happen. And the big question that we always want to advise is sitting down and formulating a plan of what that would look like, not just structurally, but emotionally, if mom and dad were to live in there. If mom and dad are investing hundreds of thousands of dollars to modify a house or to add an apartment, then the conversation needs to be had about, well, I mean, hopefully my recommendation is 2 kitchens, 2 living areas. That has been a proven need to make long-term care housing happy for everyone, is their own separate space, so you're not constantly in each other's hairs. But the conversation the child needs to have with their parent is, hey, if you're investing all this money and you're living with me, both parties need to be protected. So you have to have a plan about, what about the time when mom and dad die?
Yeah.
What is going to happen with that money they've invested? Do they expect to be put on that deed? Do they expect to earn an ownership interest in that property? Or are they going to treat it as a gift to the parent, to the child, and say, I'm giving you this $200,000, $300,000, and my hope is you let me live in this apartment that we're building. That creates a risk for the parent, because what if the kids change their minds after a few years? They don't want mom and dad to live there anymore. If it's a gift, the parents aren't protected. But if the parents own an ownership interest in that house, then it opens the kids up to the possibility of, hey, if mom or dad die and that becomes a part of their will or distributed through their trust, might they be in a position where they have to sell their own house to pay off a sibling, which you don't want them to be in that position either.
Absolutely not. Yeah. Yeah. And the thing that I think about is, what you're talking about is, if you're thinking about doing this, you guys need, before you formalize anything with your adult parent, is I would get with someone like you and draft up an agreement of paperwork of what happens upon, if I have to move out, if I have to have a care plan of, if I have Alzheimer's and have to go to memory care or other things, and how does this affect the entire family? Because like you said, interested parties, it's kind of interesting what happens. People get along really great until there's money involved.
That's exactly right. And then, I found that it just goes way beyond money, because there's the
It
whole
does.
emotional aspect as well.
Yeah,
Maybe the child that you're living with feels like, oh, I definitely deserve more because I'm doing more.
yeah,
Whereas the other kids might feel like, geez, mom and dad abandoned me because they're living with my brother or my sister, and I don't have
sure.
the opportunity to do much for them.
Yeah, yeah,
So I think it's a complicated topic, and I do think for it to be successful, it's absolutely essential that the parent and the child sit down and discuss these possible scenarios.
yeah,
And because most people only do this once in their life, I agree with you. It is best done if that parent and that child sits down with professionals who have experience guiding families through creating multi-generational housing, so you
mm-hmm,
can discuss the pros and the cons and the risks
mm-hmm.
to the parents and to the child.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, having those conversations up front is huge. You're, like you say, you deal with all the potential things that could happen up front, and communicating it to, like what you talked about, all interested parties, saying, this is what I'm going to do. This is how it's going to affect, your brothers and your sisters. This is so everybody is on the same page. They already know what your parents' wishes are. And I think that's the big piece of this is, how often do families not communicate? And there's so many times there's surprises.
Oh, absolutely. And that lack of communication is actually what so frequently leads to conflict in
Yeah.
families. It's
Yeah.
not that anyone's bad, it's not that anyone's doing anything wrong per se. It's just the parents and the siblings fail to properly communicate expectations and realities, and then it leads someone else to misunderstandings, which then
Yeah.
creates a conflict.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you're right. It's not just a matter if I were the child and I were inviting my parents to
Hmm.
have multi-generational housing with me, and that's what we're talking about today. The one thing I would want to make sure my parents do is sit down and have a conversation with my other siblings and interested parties so that
Hmm.
they are aware of my parents' wishes and
Hmm.
they're not potentially blaming me if
Hmm.
mom and dad die and they end up with less of an inheritance.
Right. Right.
Because that conversation needs to be had before that surprise
Right.
occurs.
Well, and I think the other thing that we should talk about here is, um, make the modifications before they are needed. One of the things that people say, well, I don't have to do that right now. My parents are independent. Well, all it takes is one fall.
Mm.
All it takes is one situation where all of a sudden, mom or dad need a walker. They might need a wheelchair temporarily. It
Mhm.
doesn't even matter if these modifications are not in place. Curbless shower, bathroom. What they say is the bathroom is the most dangerous room in the house. Those things are much more difficult to do when there's an emergency. To find the right contractor, to go in and get bids, and then the actual construction side can take, you know
Years,
yeah, I mean,
months,
it's
years.
crazy,
Yeah.
right? So, in doing that, making that investment before there is a move, is so important. I talk to families about that all the time. Oh, well, my mom's in rehab, so we're thinking about just bringing her home. And I
Mhm.
say, okay, well, how wide are your doorways? What do you mean? People don't even realize that there's so many considerations of bringing someone into a home. How are you going to get them in and out? Well, can't we just get somebody to come out and create a ramp? Well, not necessarily.
Yeah. Well, and in fact, if you're considering multi-generational living
Yeah,
all, I strongly recommend people to do it long before you need to.
correct.
If you have the means, if you have the means to create a separate living space with or near a child, you should do it while you're young and healthy, and you can develop that relationship and make the house ready for aging when you're, say, 70, maybe 75. Get it done. And that's
Yeah.
because it's so much easier to make that transition when everyone is healthy,
Yeah.
rather than waiting for that crisis and then trying to deal with a crisis that has already occurred. So if people
That is
are,
so true. So true.
and then on top of that, when my kids were young, my parents were such a blessing to me because they would help me out with after school care. They would help me out with, I'm stuck at work, somebody needs to drive Nisa to soccer. And if you can establish multi-generational housing when your parents are able to help
Love that.
when your kids are little, then then everyone feels much better about it because you're not only helping your parents, but your parents are helping you. And
Yeah.
and it's a relationship that benefits both parties, and it's a
Hmm.
beautiful thing. And it's a beautiful
Yeah.
thing for families if you can get that
Absolutely.
set aside and established while everyone is still healthy.
Yeah. And it's so interesting you're saying this, Andrea, because we just recently moved last year. And when we were house hunting, we walked in the bathroom and there was like grab bars in the shower. And there was like the bathroom was basically the previous tenant obviously had been a senior, and all those things were in place. And I made a side comment, me of all people. I said to my husband, I go, well, this house is for old people. My husband started
Yeah.
laughing and he said, honey, we are old people. But I kind of, for me, even me, I was like going, I'm not ready for this kind of stuff yet, being in my 60s. Well, guess what? I find myself when I'm turning around in the shower, I actually use those grab bars. It's interesting. I catch myself and I actually hang on to them. So when you're talking about doing this before, you're actually, it's amazing. I don't need a grab bar, but I use them.
Yeah,
I confess, I use them every
right.
morning when I take my shower. I find myself when I turn around, what do I do as I grab that grab bar? So it's kind of interesting how
It
you get
is.
to, and what a great thing that it's in my shower.
Right. And I just want to tack one thing on 100% do it before you need to. If you're thinking of
Yes.
multi-generational housing, do it before you need to. Do it now.
Hmm.
If you're open to it, there's nothing stopping you from doing it. But if I'm the parent, once again, if I'm the child, I'm sorry, my parents moving into me, and that was the topic of today. The other thing I think is extremely important to do is set realistic expectations.
Amen.
It's sit down and say, what do we each envision this to look like? Because that lack of communication, that lack of setting boundaries, that lack of
Mhm.
reasonable expectations is what can really lead into problems down the line.
Yes.
So put that in place before you make that decision.
Yes. And meeting with you in our closing comments on this, you guys can help as a third party come up with the things that you need to consider, and certainly draft up paperwork that can help both parties.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Andrea. It's so great to talk about this issue and so important.
All right. Thank you, Suzanne. And I hope to see you again soon.
Did you know that you can discover hundreds of podcasts in our library on senior care? So visit our website and discover our decision guides that will help you also navigate decision making. Find us at answersforelders.com.